Hello, my name is Schelkshorn, and in this presentation we will talk about key concepts that help to understand the production and role of rental housing in the context of incremental housing processes. Because of the rapid and unregulated urbanization processes in many countries in the Global South, governments have focused on self-help housing policies either through slum upgrading or resettlement programs. As a result, governments have concentrated on providing ownership and land titles for the urban poor, and rental housing policies and programs for low-income households have been neglected. However, rental housing markets are an important and integral part of urban housing systems, as there will always be population groups who need or prefer to rent a living space. Mobile populations such as seasonal workers, but also migrants who work or stay longer in cities, students, young couples, and many more groups tend to rent accommodation. When we think about rental housing, we can think of an umbrella term which covers a variety of manifestations of renting a home. In fact, diversity can be seen as one of the key features of urban rental housing markets. One common way to categorize the rental housing stock of cities is to differentiate between the types of housing providers. Rental housing can, for example, be provided and managed by cooperatives, employers, public bodies, or private landlords, just to give a few broader categories. In Latin America, Africa, and Asia, most of the low-income rental housing is provided by countless small-scale landlords. Even though they are responsible for most of the production of rental spaces, they usually have no political influence and stay invisible to their respective governments. Low-income rental housing markets in the Global South are also often characterized by informality regarding both the production and the tenure. The limited research that has been published over the past 30 years has shown that small-scale landlords often have the same modest background as their tenants. However, they are not a homogeneous group. To get an understanding about the various means and motivations of different types of small-scale landlords who provide rental housing, it is worth to have a look at Sunil Kumar's theoretical framework about small-scale landlordism in urban low-income settlements in the Global South, which he developed in the mid-1990s. In theory, we can say that any rental housing assumes commodity status because the act of renting involves the interaction of use values and exchange values. Use values are understood as the consumption of space by tenants, and exchange values as the generated rent by the landlords. Bearing that in mind, Kumar stresses the importance that any investigation into forms of landlordism must be capable to make a difference between capitalist forms of production with other forms of commodity production. What does he mean with that? In his framework, he describes low-income households who invest in their houses and distinguishes between three forms of production: non-commodity production, restricted commodity production, and generalized commodity production. In the lowest income segment, described as non-commodity production of housing, the producer of housing is not separated from the consumer. This group does not rent out and produces living space just for their own housing needs and self-consumption. On the opposite side of the spectrum is the generalized commodity production of housing. Housing producers or developers of this segment operate in a capitalist mode that aims to produce rental housing primarily to reproduce capital. In between these two forms of housing production, Kumar defines three types of petty commodity landlords who produce rental housing in the form of restricted commodity production. This means that the landlords operate below the level of general conditions of production that would be typical for capitalist landlords. The households who cannot meet their housing and living costs may be forced to convert parts of their living space in order to rent it out. In this way, the use values of parts of the living space are transformed into exchange values and serve to cover basic expenditures and housing costs of households. Kumar refers to this group as subsistence landlords, for whom the production of rental housing is a coping and survival strategy. The next range in the continuum Kumar describes as petty bourgeois landlords. These landlords do not absolutely depend on the generated rent for basic maintenance and other housing or living costs. The rental income serves as an additional income for the household and for improving the quality of the house. Petty capitalist landlords are on the higher end of the spectrum. The motivation of these types of landlords is to generate rent with the intention of expanding and reproducing the value of capital in the form of landed property. Petty capitalist landlords are restricted to produce housing in the form of a generalized commodity production, as they usually have limited access to finance and insufficient technical and management skills, among others. Kumar stresses that these three conceptual forms of small-scale landlords have to be recognized in a continuum and should not be regarded as static categories. Rental income is always used and/or invested with specific intentions which can change over time. Due to internal and external factors, homeowners who rent out can climb up and down within this continuum. Internal conditions are determined at the household level. The type of labor of the household members and the number of wage earners in the household are factors that define these internal conditions, among others. External conditions are more complex and involve the nature of state intervention, the cost of building materials, the accessibility of housing finance, the land tenure security, and many more factors. Both the internal and external conditions affect the reproduction, conservation, and/or dissolution of the various forms of landlordism. Let's have a brief look into a sites and services resettlement, which is located in the city of Chennai in India. The settlement Ambedkar Nagar was implemented at the beginning of the 1990s. Beneficiaries faced a lot of challenges during the first years, also because of the remote location of the site and the lack of employment opportunities. 30 years later, the rapidly growing city has incorporated the area. There are various types of small-scale landlords who provide a range of rental accommodation in terms of quality and size for both low and middle income groups. On the lower segment, we find rental spaces in some of the still existing initial houses of the settlement. Simple rooms that have been attached on terraces are part of the incremental building process and are also rented out as basic accommodation. On the higher segment, we find small rented apartments in multi-story residential buildings with small balconies and tiled floors. Over the years, Ambedkar Nagar has developed into a densely populated, economically diverse and safe neighborhood. It is important to see that the local informal rental housing market has played a major role in the incremental housing process and the positive development of the area. I would like to conclude this presentation with some takeaways. Rental housing and homeowner markets are complementary segments and both integral part of well-functioning housing markets that meet the housing needs of an urban population. Most low-income rental housing in the Global South is provided by small-scale landlords who are not a homogeneous group and who are most of the time not recognized by their respective governments. Rental housing is an essential part of the consolidation process of settlements that follow the idea of incremental housing. And Housing policies and programs that allow incremental housing processes are helping to create affordable rental housing markets for low and middle income groups in the long run.